Hi everyone, this is Robert and welcome to IDG Live. This is a sort of a continuation Q&A, to be honest. Last week I did an open Q&A covering pretty much anything, but 3.5 hours later I found that I was still covering the questions about Song of Ice and Fire. So what I did was I cut that one, I say cut it short, we were going for nearly 4 hours by the end, but I cut that one short and said this time we will cover mostly Lord of the Rings. So that's what's going on. We have got a few other questions dotted in around from my patrons. I've got some questions about The Witcher and a few other random things. And I've got a couple of sort of hangover questions about A Song of Ice and Fire. But that's what it is. It will be dotting around quite a lot, obviously, as it's an open Q&A. We'll be going to a lot of different places. But let's get straight into it with one of those questions. As I say, it was just hanging over from last time. Actually, this was hanging over from a couple of weeks ago. Rabbi and Mitra, thank you for your patience with this one. This is A Song of Ice and Fire question. In A Feast for Crows, Sam recalls that Maester Aemon, once wailed from his dreams, saying, "A dragon has 3 heads, but I am too old and frail to be one of them." Considering your video on Daemon and Vermithor, is it safe to say that Aemon finally realized the long-lost process of dragon bonding and realized that his role was about playing the priest role between Dany and her dragons? Imagine the possibilities, and especially against Euron, who has the Dragonbinder horn. Could you take some of the aspects discussed in the video and apply them now to Aemon and the possible implications for Marwyn and the crew in the Winds of Winter? Okay, a little bit of background for this. If you remember in House of the Dragon, last episode, there was a small scene, it was only like a minute or two long, where in amidst all of the action that was going on, Daemon goes into a cave, finds the dragon Vermithor, and then starts singing to it. Now, he sang in High Valyrian. We have got a hold of the translation of that, which is an official bit of translation. It wasn't written by George R.R. Martin himself, but it was written by T. McKell, who is very close, and translated into High Valyrian by David Peterson, the guy who came up with the language of High Valyrian. So this is definitely worth paying attention to. And when you dig into the details of those lyrics, and I did a video, if you want all of the detail of it, I did a video a few weeks ago on it. You see that whatever else it might be about, this is about 3 people, or 1 dragon and 2 people. Daemon is singing the song. He is singing the song to the dragon, and they are effectively calling out to a 3rd. The implication perhaps is the 3rd is a dragon rider, the person who will bond with the dragon maybe, and the person singing the song seems therefore to be playing a sort of interlocutor or priest or presiding person in some way. It's not clear. We haven't got the full bits of lore on this, but this is the first bit of understanding that we have about how this might work. So how does this play in to A Song of Ice and Fire? If we assume that this is at least getting the thumbs up from George R.R. Martin, the dragon has 3 heads. Maester Aemon bewailing the fact that he is too old to be one of those dragons. Does it mean that he's understood all of this ancient lore about dragon bonding? Not necessarily. He could just be thinking in the way that almost everybody else in the world thinks of the dragon has 3 heads. There are 3 Targaryens, 3 dragons, the original 3, and therefore we need 3 dragons. We need 3 Targaryens to ride the 3 dragons that Dany has. And he's saying he's too old. So that doesn't necessarily mean that he understands it. But what if there's someone who does? Euron. Now, Euron has got hold of this Dragonbinder, this mighty magical, it would appear, magical horn, which claims to be able to control dragons. Now, we have learned that the Valyrians used to have horns that could control their dragons, so he does seem to be onto something there. And he's given this to Victarion, who is, in George R. R. Martin's words, thick as a stump, and so doesn't exactly know everything that's going on. He is clearly tricking him somehow. The idea being that he was going to get Victarion to blow the horn, and the horn was actually bound to Euron, not to Victarion. So, what might this mean? On the plain text reading there, maybe Euron is the person who is supposed to be, if we're looking for three characters, we have them. We've got the dragon, we've got the person blowing the horn, and we've got Euron himself, the person who's going to be riding the dragon, theoretically. Now, what happens if somebody blows the horn and it is connected off to Euron? Perhaps, and this is a perhaps, but it's been a possibility ever since we got to the end of A Dance with Dragons, perhaps Euron will succeed. Perhaps he will get one of those dragons. Maybe, though, we have to take into account the fact that there is somebody on board that ship who absolutely 100% does not want anyone taking Dany's dragons. And that is Mokoro, the Red Priest. He has been sent there specifically to help her as she engages in, first of all, getting to Westeros and then fighting against the others. So the connection across to what we've potentially just learned about dragon bonding, it kind of makes sense. It all kind of fits together, in which case Euron would be the dragon rider, the person being bonded. However, whether it goes to plan is another matter entirely. Maura Lee in the chat, very generous super chat. Thank you so much, Maura, saying, in honor of Bilbo and Frodo Baggins, whose birthdays we will be celebrating again soon this month. Yeah, it's Hobbit Day coming up in just a couple of weeks' time. Just a show of love and appreciation for all the content. I'm loving listening to the story Dracula on the Well Told Tale. Looking forward to part 2. Yes, my side project, it's another channel. The Well Told Tale is also a podcast. This is me audio narrating my favorite fantasy and science fiction stories, the classic stories. And I've just started Dracula. The podcast is a little bit ahead of the YouTube channel. So if you want Dracula, you'll have to try and find the podcast, but it will be appearing on the YouTube channel soon. I'm glad you're enjoying that, though. Great story, really is. And Marley also picking up a question from Delicon Nil. Thank you. I love it when people do this. Saying, does the One Ring adjust its size to fit the wearer? I don't think Sauron and Bilbo have the same finger size. Yes, I think is the short answer. We're not ever given sort of chapter and verse on this, but yes, the clear implication is that it shifts to the finger size of whoever is wearing it, and also whether it wishes to be worn. So when Isildur had it, then he could put it on and wear it, and that was fine. But then it wished to get off of his finger, so it just made itself bigger and fell off. So it made itself smaller for Smeagol, for Gollum, for Bilbo. The interesting point about this, that again, attention's not drawn to it, but this is the kind of the detail that Tolkien loves to put in there, is that what happens is that Frodo then puts it on a chain around his neck, because that's the thing that is actually preventing it from slipping away, because it will be able to sense it's getting closer and closer to Mount Doom, and it will not want to go there. If he just put it in a pocket or something, then maybe it could like move itself around a little bit. We don't know all the extent of the details here. Change in size, perhaps. No. If you feed it through a chain, a metal chain, and put that chain around your neck, that's the best way of stopping it actually escaping. So yeah, a good question that's slightly deeper than it may first appear. Let's go to Hey Martinez. I saw you there in the chat. Great to see you, and super chat from you. Thank you very much. Saying, which place is more frightening to live in as a human? Khan Doom in Angmar under the Witch King, or the Dread Fort under Ramsay Bolton? More frightening to live in as a human. Well, Angmar is I think quite clear in my view. Under Ramsay Bolton, yeah, if you're on the wrong side of the Boltons, then that would be a pretty horrific place to be. But Ramsay is fundamentally a pragmatist, and he doesn't just flay or kill anybody. He needs people to work, to get the food in, to be serving in his army, and he might well rule with a rod of iron and be really scary, but your chances of surviving that are much higher than a human trying to escape the wrath of the Witch King, I would say. Added to which, the Witch King is magical. Okay, let's go to a question from Brandy 1842, which starts about A Song of Ice and Fire, but quickly moves on into a question about Lord of the Rings. To put it in Maester Aemon's words, once in a man's life there comes a moment when it's not easy, when he must choose. Also, did Aragorn kill all the baby orcs in their little orc cradles? This is a classic question. If you've not come across this before, this isn't just something that somebody's just randomly thought of. This is a George R. R. Martin quote. George R. R. Martin loves The Lord of the Rings. He's a huge Tolkien fan. I defy you to watch or read any lengthy interview with him when he does not start randomly going off and talking about the Lord of the Rings. He is obsessed with it. However, that does not mean that he is not without his criticisms, and some of these criticisms he has voiced. Now, I've made videos about a few of these because I think that he perhaps misses the point sometimes. Here, he critiques the idea of just saying Aragorn was a good king at the end, because he then says, what I want to know more. I want to understand more about what sort of king he was. What was Aragorn's tax policy? Did a video on that one. And also, if we're saying that they just wiped out the orcs, does that mean that Aragorn went out and killed all the baby orcs in their little orc cradles? I have done a video on this one as well, but I can give you the short answer on this. A lot of people say, hey, but orcs, they're not, they don't have orc babies. They do. In Tolkien's world, we don't see them, but they are definitely there. They reproduce in the fashion of men, I think is what Tolkien's phraseology is in the Silmarillion. So they do. The first orcs were converted, changed elves. But then later you get generation after generation after generation after generation. So did Aragorn kill them? Well, what happened to the orcs? The fact is that when the Black Tower fell, when the One Ring was destroyed, when Sauron's rule was ended, the orcs that had been closest to him in Mordor, we're told basically the cutting of that controlling contact was so great that many of them just they jumped into cracks in the ground, they ran screaming, they killed each other, they just lost all control. So most of those orcs actually it never came to that. There's other orcs who were further away and who had slightly less strong connection with Sauron. Here we're thinking about the orcs in and under the Misty Mountains. They surely survived the end of Sauron's power. However, we do know that the dwarves came and reclaimed Moria. So those orcs were dealt with not by Aragorn, but by the dwarves. What is left? Yes, Aragorn went and killed all the orcs. So whether we think that's a morally grey area or not, that does seem to be the clear implication. Tolkien doesn't give it much attention because his story's over. His story that he was telling in The Lord of the Rings is not about the Fourth Age and Aragorn's rule. It was about what led up to it. And so, no, he doesn't give all of the details about what happened in Aragorn's rule. But then I'm sure George R. R. Martin won't give all the details of everything that happened after the story of A Song of Ice and Fire is finished. J. Carroll saying, much love, muchacho. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Let's go to... and Mark Shees is saying, yeah, the race of orcs in the Fourth Age must have somehow withered away, just like dwarves and elves and everything else magical. Yeah, that's the sort of the bigger issue, is that when we get to the Fourth Age, magic sort of, as far as we can tell, it sort of drains out from the world. The magical creatures dwindle and die. The elves head off to the west, and those that don't do. And Galadriel came out with a wonderful little turn of phrase about it that I shall paraphrase, that we shall diminish into creatures of dell and grove or something like that. I think she said the dwarves go digging deeper and deeper. The dragons, the biggest dragons, will have gone, and the dragons sort of go off into the edges of civilization and slowly die out. The magical things in the world just diminish slowly. So yeah, that is what will happen from the orcs as well. Let's go to a question from Matthew Hawkins. Necessity is the mother of invention. But in over 3,000 years of the Second Age of Middle-earth, why did the Sindar kings, Oropher and Amdir, not provide their army with adequate armor? If they could not make it themselves, why not swallow their pride and buy it off of the dwarves of Khazad-dûm? It's a good question. So this is about the elves of Mirkwood, although at the time it was the elves of Greenwood. Now, we have Oropher, who was the father of Thranduil, who was the elven king at the time of The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, and the father of Legolas. Oropher got involved in the last alliance of elves and men against Sauron, marched his army to the south, didn't wait for orders, went charging into battle, lost a lot of men. There's a whole other story there, but one of the details of that is that they were lightly armed and not really prepared for a massive battle. So why didn't they, in all that time, actually armor themselves up? I think the first answer is the obvious one, which is that they were a woodland-dwelling folk, and so they were armored for woodland combat. So we would expect that in any kind of army throughout history is that they would get caught out by the needs of a different type of armor and weaponry outside of their own natural location. But I think that the deeper point here is that what that community was something strikingly different from a lot of the rest of the elven community that we often talk about. This was an attempt at a back to basics, back to the good old days. Let's recreate what it was like really at the start of the elves being here kind of community. Because what we had, that community was not just like one group who'd always been there. It was a group of several different groups who all came together. One were the group who did, this is going way back in history, they did accept when the Valar said, hey, come with us over to the west. They did go, but then they got to the Misty Mountains and it's a little bit difficult. Let's just stay here. So they weren't as committed as all the other elves who went off to the ideal of sort of heading to the west. Then they were joined by some of the Avari, those who had refused in the first place but sort of wandered around anyway. Then they were joined by a group of people who had left Doriath. Now, Doriath had been a secret, not really secret, but a city that was well defended and had a beautiful carved out cave system, and because it had this protection from one of the Maiar, Melian the Maiar was their queen. She had this protection that was called the Girdle of Melian around that land, and it could stay nice and peaceful and happy and beautiful. So what we had in Greenwood was this community of people who, for whatever reason, they weren't the go-getters who are wanting to head off to the west. They're not the great craftsmen of the Noldor. They all wanted to recreate sort of a more traditional, in their minds, elven lifestyle. They wanted to live in the forest and in the caves, and they weren't there about crafting great magics. They were about being close to nature, about loving and working with the environment that they were in. And as a result, no, they weren't about crafting magnificent new bits of armor for themselves. They'd actually managed for most of that time to steer well clear of any significant combat, so it hadn't really needed to happen. And when people did come into their woods, this was their terrain. So why not make your own armor? Because that's just not what they're about. Why not buy armor? Well, the dwarves had shut up shop by that point. The dwarves had closed Khazad-dûm. There was no chance of getting them back again. A few people in the chat saying they appreciated my 7th Age video, which I was very pleased with how that came out, actually. So yeah, if you've not watched it yet, this was almost a throwaway comment from Tolkien. I would have said it was a throwaway comment from Tolkien in one of his letters, but for the fact that he came back to it and talked about it again in a later letter, that he said, I think, here's me spoiling my own videos, but I think we're now in the 7th Age. And it's like, say what? We know about the 1st Age, the 2nd Age, 3rd Age, the 4th Age. What? How do we get to the 7th Age? What about the 5th and the 6th Age? And so this is just trying to unpick what he was talking about and what the actually quite significant implications are for what he was trying to do with his created world. Because I think it does actually shine a slightly different light on what he... how he wanted us to interrelate with the world that he created. But anyway, thank you very much for those people saying it was good. Let's go to Nicole Stewart. Hi, Robert. I'm currently listening to The Return of the King. I find that Denethor is quite cruel to his son Faramir. What is the cause of it? There is clear favoritism towards his other son Boromir, but the words he spews to Faramir is on another level. Yeah, so this came out on the film and the movie, but perhaps not to... It didn't quite capture all the layers of subtlety of what was going on that's there in the book. And it is explained in a reasonable amount of detail. And the first thing to say is that he didn't actually hate Faramir, but there's a lot of displaced fear and hatred that has made him focus his energies on Faramir. Now, the first one, obviously, is that he's got a favourite, Boromir. Boromir is everything that he could want from a son. He's the guy who is what he thinks an heir, because basically in the absence of the kings, the stewards are the ruling family. The heir to Gondor should be like. He is a strong fighter. He's clearly absolutely focused on protecting Minas Tirith and Gondor. He's a leader of men. He enjoys active sports and the like. So that's Boromir. Faramir is actually quite bookish. He's quite a nerd. Yeah, he can do the fighting things. Yes, he'll go. He knows that that's his role, is he has to put on the army, he has to go and fight, and he seems to be reasonably competent at it. But clearly that's not what his heart is in. He does not seek glory in battle. He just sees that as a thing that he sometimes has to do. So there is a difference there that Denethor could see, not just in a, well, I have a favourite out of my sons, but also Denethor increasingly becomes absolutely convinced that this is life or death for Gondor. This is the end of time. Sauron's going to attack. They have to survive. And Boromir is exactly what he thinks he needs and what Gondor needs, and Faramir is not. So that's one layer. Another area which isn't unpicked huge amounts, but it is clearly there, is that Denethor's wife, Findulas, died about 5 years after Faramir was born. And yet there is a link in Denethor's mind between Faramir's birth and Findulas's death, because she became very ill and she stayed very ill all the way from Faramir's birth all the way through to Findulas's death. So he has this kind of not blaming his son for his wife's death, but also slightly blaming his son for his wife's death. And then the third strand, there are a few more, but I think this is the third most important one. The third strand is that Denethor is very aware of his role as steward, and he's very aware of the potential for the returning king to be challenging him for the rule of Gondor. And you add Aragorn into this equation. He's no fool. He knows what's going on there. And Aragorn, way before the events of the Lord of the Rings, he had come through. He took on an alias, and he just sort of like came in and spent some time in Minas Tirith, and everybody loved him. Who's this guy? He's great, and they all wanted to follow him. And Denethor puts two and two together, and when Gandalf who's clearly friends with Aragorn, keeps on coming to visit, and then he starts talking to and making friends with Faramir, because Faramir and Gandalf started getting to be close friends. He sees Faramir as actually being engaged with the enemy, with the people who are trying to get his family off of, not the throne, because they don't sit on the throne, but out of power in Gondor. And so he is deeply suspicious. He calls him names of like a wizard's pupil or something like that. He's personally challenged by Gandalf. And the fact that Faramir is doing that, he feels undermines him in his position. So there's lots of different layers. In the books, it's very clear that despite all of this, he does hugely love Faramir in his own way. I mean, we get, Denethor does love Faramir, and he will show it in the end. They did show just a hint of that, I think, in the films. But yeah, it's a multi-layered thing. It is what they're about, who they are as people. He had a favourite. There's the link across to the death of Findulas, their mother, and then there's also the link across to Aragorn and Gandalf. Let's go to Martin S. saying, legendary elves, brackets Fingolfin, seem to be the greatest free people heroes. Is it long experience? Male hero or men heroes like Hurin are close. Dwarves heroes seemingly lesser. Maybe because dwarves were made by Aula, not Eru. Well, it's possible. I think you have to add in the other element to this, which is the stories that we get that are in the Silmarillion are elvish stories. They're stories recorded by the elves, and then translated across basically by Bilbo. And so we're reading the elvish history of the world. And the elvish history of the world is, yes, they record some of the bad things they did, but it's much more likely to be good and show them in a good light than it is the dwarves in a good light. We don't know huge amounts about most of the Durins, who are the legendary leaders of Durin's folk. So we've got an absence of information. That said, the high elves, those elves who have been to the Undying Lands, to Valinor, and then come across, they seem hugely powerful. Fingolfin literally faces off against Morgoth and injures him. We're told that Feanor, when he first arrived across from Valinor, he gets taken down eventually by a group of Balrogs plural, But if he had, we're basically told, if he had got to Morgoth, then he'd have a fighting chance. Morgoth was weakened at the time, but he would have a fighting chance against him. But the whole advance slowed down, or more precisely, Feanor got so excited that he charged on ahead and left his army behind. A big mistake. So the light of the two trees gave extra power to those elves who came across. And so, yes, they are incredibly mighty and powerful. Humans, the great human warriors, did to an extent as well, but we just don't really see or hear the stories of the dwarves, I'm afraid. Aegon Dragonborn saying, George R. Martin has said that Tolkien handled the good versus evil concept brilliantly, but in his imitators' work, the conflict comes out as cartoonish. What makes Lord of the Rings' depiction of good versus evil special? I mean, I think it's because it's not just... Yes, it is fundamentally about good versus evil, but it's not just a straightforward, here are the good guys, here are the bad guys. You have flawed good guys, you have good bad guys. And each of the bad guys, that when you start digging into them more and more, they're layered. It's not just that they're evil and want to take over the world. Sauron has layers to him. It's about control. There's a bitterness there. There's a rejection thing going on. There's lots of issues going on with Sauron. So we can actually sympathize, or at least understand, where some of these bad guys are coming from. The imitators of Tolkien, I don't know who exactly, when you're quoting that, I did that very tropey. These are the good guys, those are the bad guys. The bad guys are trying to take over the world, the good guys are trying to save it. That's not what it's about. Tolkien has got many, many more layers. The nerd far away asking a light-hearted question: do I think I'm most like an elf, man, Maiar, or hobbit? Well, probably changes day by day, but today I'm definitely a hobbit. Let's go with Alison saying, hello, Robert. In The Hobbit, Sauron is referred to as the necromancer. What are Sauron's powers? It seems to me he is much more than a necromancer. So what then was he working on in Dol Guldur that earned him this moniker? Also, do you think necromancy was involved in the creation of the Mouth of Sauron? Well, I'll talk very quickly about the Mouth of Sauron, because we actually have a couple of paragraphs from Tolkien that tells us about Mouth of Sauron. He's a fascinating character because he just appears for just a scene. He's not mentioned before. There were some hints about what he might have been doing before, but he's not mentioned before. He's not really mentioned afterwards either. He's just there, but for that little bit, he's an incredibly central character. And he plays, as the Mouth of Sauron, he plays the role thematically of Sauron for us, so that we can actually see what the reaction is to what's going on. And what I mean by is off camera, all of this. The main antagonist, we see his fall simply by a tower crumbling, and a volcano blowing up and things like that. We don't actually see Sauron other than like clouds and smoke and things along those lines. So Tolkien gives us the Mouth of Sauron so that we can get just a hint, an echo of what must be going on with Sauron. But in order to do that, he had to give us a little bit of an explainer who this guy was who had just come out to talk to Aragorn and Gandalf. And I've got the quote here. The rider was robed all in black, and black was his lofty helm. Yet this was no ringwraith, but a living man. The lieutenant of the Tower of Barad-dûr he was, and his name is remembered in no tale, for he himself had forgotten it. And he said, I am the Mouth of Sauron. But it is told that he was a renegade who came of the race of those that are named the Black Numenorians, for they established their dwellings in Middle-earth during the years of Sauron's domination, and they worshipped him, being enamoured of evil knowledge. And he entered the service of the Dark Tower when it first rose again, and because of his cunning, he grew ever higher in the Lord's favour, and he learned great sorcery and knew much of the mind of Sauron, and he was more cruel than any orc. So the short answer is, was there any necromancy involved in the creation of the Mouth of Sauron? No, the Mouth of Sauron was a human, a man, who had basically joined up. But he was incredibly resourceful. He was very clever. He climbed the greasy pole and learned great magical powers. And he took on the name of the Mouth of Sauron to the extent that he forgot what his own name was. So no, there was no necromancy involved there. However, yes, when Sauron came back in the Third Age, after we get his big defeat at the end of the Second Age, he disappears for 1,000 years and then reappears in Greenwood the Great. He takes over the old castle of Dol Guldur, which had been held by Orifer and the elves of Greenwood the Great, but if you remember, they lost huge amounts of people in that battle, and they basically abandoned most of the south of Greenwood. And so Sauron saw the opportunity and moved in, and here's an old castle to move into. And he became known as the Necromancer. Now, why? Well, Tolkien obviously loved language, and I think in sort of older, more Middle English than the specific use we have today of somebody who's like a magician purely about bringing zombies or skeletons or something like that. That is not the old use of it. Yes, it was to do with the death arts and things like that. It was a dark magician, but it wasn't just somebody who could be summoning beasts from beyond the grave. Now, was he doing any magic with sort of beyond the grave stuff? Well, yes. On himself, first of all, he was disembodied. He'd lost his body at the end of the Second Age, and he was in his own more thematic way, he was also sort of beyond the grave. In Gandalf had died and come back, if you remember, later on in the Third Age in the main story. This was a bit like that, but he had done some magic, putting his soul into the One Ring, which meant that he could still cling on. He could still stay there. Now, so he himself was involved in that. We're told several times back in the Silmarillion in the Second Age that he would use wraiths and ghosts in certain... He took over a forest and then filled it with ghosts, we're told. There's obviously also what he did with the ring wraiths, with the Nazgul. They were being held, their lives were being stretched, but they became incorporeal. So their bodies were not there. It was just their spirits and souls that were remaining. If you remember the Witch King, in his helmet there was actually nothing. There was just a crown hovering above his head. So yes, he's involved in what we consider necromantic magic. So my guess is that he was wanting to be incognito when he was there. He'd picked somewhere which perhaps you don't think is the most obvious place to be, Greenwood the Great. There's some elves there. The dwarves are right nearby, slap bang in the middle of Middle-earth, where people might see him. But at the same time, if he'd come back to Mordor or somewhere, he probably would have been noticed straight away. When he's in Greenwood, he could just very slowly recover himself and start to set the darkness growing around him, turning Greenwood the Great into Mirkwood. So that, I think, is the plan. And so as a result, what sorts of magics would he be doing early on? Well, it's not, I think I will call all the orcs to me now. I think that I will get all my closest lieutenants and build a new base here. He was trying to keep things quiet. He was not wanting people to see that this is Sauron. They just thought this is another evil magician of some kind. Martin S. Reflective Rambling. Hi there. Good to see you in the chat. Martin S., I have a bit of a parallel between Aragorn and Gandalf on one hand and Arthur and Merlin on the other. The king and his wizards. A comment? Well, yes, in as much as Gandalf takes on this role of the wise, timeless wizard advising a king, which is... that's the situation with Merlin and Arthur. And I would say the difference between them is that in most of the legends, Merlin seems to be standoffish, and he is definitely guiding stuff, but he's manipulating stuff, and he is putting people on the throne that he wants to be on the throne, and you never 100% sure of his agenda. With Gandalf, you are. He is very clear what he's about. Everybody knows it. And that is, it shines through all the way. He is self-sacrificial, and he actively gets in to dangerous situations himself and tries to rally people around. And he does not pick as his champion. Merlin has effectively as his champion Arthur, this great swordsman and leader of men. Yes, Gandalf has got Aragorn, who he works with, but the person he picks to be sort of the key person is Frodo. So there is a very big difference, I would say, between the characters, the traditional character of Merlin and the character of Gandalf. Let's go to question. So M&M just in the chat saying, just curious, Aragorn was in love with Arwen, Sam was enamored with Rosie. Did Boromir and the other members of the Fellowship have any loves besides the Halfling's Leaf? It's a really interesting question because we're not told huge amounts about this. Frodo certainly never married, and we don't get any hint of him ever being romantically connected to anybody. Ditto Boromir. I think that the assumption is that probably he would have some sort of political marriage at some point. I think that that's the kind of idea that you get going on there. Legolas, no, we hear nothing. Gimli, no, we hear nothing. Merry and Pippin, however, when they return, they do both marry and have children. So there are relationships there other than the two or three that we know about. But very broadly speaking, yes, the Fellowship weren't. Yeah, they were all sort of young single men, basically. Some of them quite old, but yeah, that's it. Silly, yeah. So saying silly is good. Eminem, yeah, it was quite a fun question. Let's go to. I think that was Alison's question. I think I've answered that one now. So let's go to Zachalok. Bonjour, Robert. Bonjour. I've always found the relationship between Frodo and Sam a bit weird or uncomfortable. Sam always refers to Frodo as Mr. or Master, as if they had a social class difference, which might be true at the beginning, but this should change during their adventures. How can you characterize this relationship, and what do you think of it? Well, yes, at the beginning, there clearly is a social divide there. Frodo is this independently wealthy man who seemingly doesn't need to do any work. And Sam is his gardener. his paid employee. Now, Tolkien has very strongly come out as clarifying that the kind of relationship that he saw between Frodo and Sam was the kind of thing that he saw in World War I in the trenches. He was, because at this point he was an academic, he was more of the kind of the middle class end of things, but the officers had what were then called Batmen, not like a Batman, but they had people who would just work for them, and they would do, be at that person's beck and call. They would be their servant. They would cook for them. They would run errands for them. And Tolkien obviously was a creature of his own time, and so there's no real social critique from him on this. But he does say that he views, and I can't remember the exact words, but he viewed them as the greatest of people. These Batmen, these servants, who he thought that they were much superior to the people that they were serving in almost every way. And this, incidentally, this is something which comes through. I think if you actually look at C.S. Lewis, his great friend and also a fellow author, he also has this slightly glorified approach to the English or British working class. If you read The Magician's Nephew, you'll know exactly what I mean. There's a cabbie there who's a great character, who is portrayed as being actually much more noble than the extremely middle class peasantry children and all of the other extremely middle class English children who are the main characters in the story. Similarly, you can find in other stories, you can find the Weasleys are undeniably, in my view, written as the most sympathetic family in all of the Hogwarts world, and they are written as poorer working class people. So this kind of English fantasy world idea of the working class as being actually far superior to the middle and upper classes is not unique to Tolkien, but it's definitely strong in his work. So that's the sort of the overall context of what's going on here. And so it makes sense in world, in the Lord of the Rings, it makes sense that is the dynamic. When they set off, Sam is setting off as his employee, his servant, basically. Now, clearly he cares about him, they care about each other, but that is the social dynamic. What you say is that this surely would have changed by the end, and I understand that completely. I get that on a normal journey. However, what happened, particularly towards the end, is that Sam's natural tendencies as a person, what we would say nowadays, I think, is his love language. His love language was acts of service. That's how he showed he cared. And the further into the story we get, the less Frodo can do on his own. And his way of showing his care, his way of doing his acts of service was to cook him his food, carry stuff for him, be encouraging him, being the person that we know as Sam. And that naturally put him into that role that he was at the beginning of the story. So, yeah, perhaps on a normal story, you might expect the dynamic to change somewhat. However, the way that this story pans out actually and actively pushes those two into the roles that they had to start with, which means that the connection that they have between those two, that stays the same, and we can see all the shifts that are happening around them. So I think that was deliberate on Tolkien's part. He had created a dynamic at the beginning. What we do see is the shift in dynamic once it's ended. And what I mean by that is that Frodo, after all this, clearly sees him as an equal, as a friend. He says, "You can have my house. I want you to finish this story that is my family's story. I want you to write the last chapter." He's seeing him as an equal, indeed as a member of the family by that point. So the shift comes not during the story, but after it. Caius Ballerina. We know that Morgoth's creatures are a mockery of Eru's children. Elves for orcs, Ents for trolls. But what are dragons a mockery of? Well, it's a good question. The biggest kind of speculation we have is if you ignore the first dragon, which didn't have wings, afterwards, then these are a mockery of the eagles. Because the eagles are not just normal eagles. These are messengers for Manwë. These are not just normal-sized eagles. These are massive. They're the size of a B-52 bomber, the biggest eagles. So, yeah, it would make sense if you have an eagle which is there, beautiful, graceful, always on time, and then the mockery or imitation is this cruel, selfish, scaly, quite literally lizard-like thing. Then yeah, that kind of is where we go with that, I think. John Potts saying that Legolas and Gimli only didn't marry because the laws didn't allow it. They left for the Grey Havens together. They did indeed. I mean, I'm very open and happy with all readings of this. I don't think the fact that they left together, I think, is as much that Legolas knew how to do it and Gimli had got an invitation. Gimli, I was very much, I don't know, low-key in love with Galadriel. I don't know quite how low-key it was at the time. So that doesn't mean that you're not right, but I think that there's layers to that one, I think, as well. Let's go to Lucian just pointed, good point here, saying we kind of see class distinctions amongst the wizards and they're a population of 5. Yeah, we do. There's clearly an order and a ranking in them. And TK of Dollar Amroth actually pointing out, I think it's quite an important distinction, particularly for people in America, where class is often about, and actually, I think you said it better than me, it's more family. In the UK, class isn't based on income. It's more about family background, upbringing, lifestyle, historic landowner titles, things like that. Yeah, absolutely. So to kind of understand where in this class structure in England today, but also when we're thinking of hobbits and the like, or indeed men in Middle Earth, then it's not about how much money they have. Aragorn is still upper class, regardless of whether he wanders around and sleeps in bushes and doesn't carry much money with him. He's definitely upper class. And similarly, it doesn't matter whether Frodo had money or not. He would still be upper middle class, I think I'd probably say. Eminem's asking if there's enough literature for a series or film about the reign of Aragorn and the lives of the other characters post the Scouring of the Shire. No, well, not honestly, not enough to do a detailed one in and of itself. I mean, you could make a TV show about anything if you want to. We just don't have much to go on. We know in terms of the hobbits, for example, we know how many children they had, we know what jobs they had afterwards, but anyhow, we know what sort of bits of writing or hobbies they might have had, and we know how they ended their days. But that still leaves decades where what happened, I don't know. Sam was probably gardening, this kind of thing. So we don't know all the details. Similarly with Aragorn, we know how long his reign was. We know the headlines of what his reign was. We know a little bit about his marriage. We know about, he had a son. We know those things, but in terms of an actual story, there isn't a story there. Charis saying, "Greetings, Robert and Dan. This isn't so much a question as an observation concerning Gandalf's firework dragon in the opening chapter of The Lord of the Rings. It says, the dragon passed like an express train, turned a somersault, and burst over by water with a deafening explosion. Tolkien's writing in Lord of the Rings is deliberately archaic, making this anachronistic description of an express train both anomalous and startling. It is true that this one chapter of Lord of the Rings is stylistically more akin to The Hobbit, but I find it odd that Tolkien either didn't perceive how out of place it was or felt it was necessary to alter it. Similarly, I've always thought it was strange that the Ents marching song should reference human war accoutrements. We come with horn and drum, noting that the Ents have very little interaction with humans and are not concerned with their affairs. To me, this feels very out of place. The more so given the authenticity of the languages and idioms used throughout the books. I'd be interested in your thoughts on these two linguistic anomalies. Well, really fine question. The first one, the dragon passed like this is the firework dragon, the description being the dragon passed like an express train, turned a somersault, and burst over by water with a deafening explosion. So this, I think, if we're to come with an explanation for this, yes, I agree. To my ear, it does also have a slightly anachronistic slant. That Tolkien does this quite a few times. It's actually a little bit of a quirk, not this anachronistically, but it's a little quirk of his writing that some people enjoy. I enjoy. Some people don't necessarily enjoy, which is that he can be writing about something and then just sort of like head off and say something that is completely related, but it's just off at a tangent in a like the time. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, feel free to Google it because it's a really fun. The paragraph where the point of view suddenly shifts to a fox that we never hear from again. Or when Sam just sees Mordor and then we suddenly get this 2 or 3 sentence description about basically the geography, layout and economy of the far side of Mordor. It's like Tolkien just dropped that in there. Similarly, here we get this description, which is like slightly left field. It doesn't feel like it quite hangs in the narrative. If we're to come with a sort of to defend Tolkien on this, other than this is clearly how he enjoyed writing, he does seem to have had quite a quirky, an unexpectedly quirky sense of humor. I think what we would say is something along the lines of, in world, what Tolkien says is that what we are reading is not just a made-up story from him. It's not a made-up story from somebody's point of view in particular. This is a story which was written by basically 3 hobbits, which then got tweaked and changed a little bit by people in Gondor, the wise people in Gondor. Then it went back again and was edited a little bit more when it came back to the Shire. Then it got passed down several directions. Then he, in world, as a scholar, discovered these ancient manuscripts, translated them, and is presenting them to us. So there's a lot of times when the authorship of this shifted, and something like this, which is anachronistic, clearly in world, again, if we're trying to defend Tolkien here, in world, this is Tolkien taking what it was and trying to give us, the modern day reader, an understanding of what that firework was like, and he explained it in the way, in our language, rather than trying to use whatever was there. So that, I think, is how we can potentially defend that. The second one about the Ents. This is the Ents when the last march of the Ents, and they're going to war, and they have this long song, obviously, which starts with we come with horn and drum. And your challenge there is that this is clearly a human thing. Horns and drums are clearly a human thing. I think I would, on this one, I would challenge back a bit, because who's to say that the Ents don't have horns and drums? I think we sometimes think of Ents, I'm not saying you do, but I think sometimes we corporately can think of Ents as just being trees. And that is indeed where they go to. But it's very clear that although we don't see huge amounts about their culture, there's a bit more there. They use things, they utilize stuff. Each of the Ents seems to have its own home. Each of these homes seems to be slightly different. Now, we get a bit of Treebeard's home. There seem to be, it depends on how literally you interpret these things, but there certainly seems to be furniture. There seems to be a bowl of some kind. He's clearly thought out where the water goes, and there seem to be sort of like hangings, perhaps curtains, that kind of thing. So they make things, they use things. So why wouldn't they use a horn or a drum? And I think that for me, perhaps they don't have them at the time. They were being very hasty with their attack. But for me, if you had to picture anything that the Ents might use, banging on a drum doesn't need to be a modern masterpiece drum that we have these days, but just something that could boom, boom, boom like that. You could well see that might work for them. Similarly, a horn doesn't have to be made out of anything that a modern horn might be made out of. It could just be something they found lying around, a hollowed out old bit of a strong tree, perhaps. You could see that might turn into a horn of sorts. So I personally, on this one, I view towards this is hinting at things that we do not yet know about the Ents, rather than they clearly didn't have this, therefore this is an anachronistic thing. So that's my general take on that one. Snowgal saying, hello, Robert. I don't have a Lord of the Rings or Witcher question, so I hope it's okay to just ask if you've ever read Lois McMaster Bujold's The Curse of Chalion and what you thought of it. If you haven't read it, I can't recommend it strongly enough. It's truly the best one-shot. The short answer to this is that I don't think I have read it, so I can't really comment on it. I had in my head I had read some Lois McMaster Bujold's, but in preparation for this stream, I had a look on my bookshelves and I couldn't find any. Doesn't mean I've never read her, but I will, on your recommendation, happily add that to my reading list. For those who do not know, she is one of the winniest fantasy and science fiction authors out there. I think she's won 4 Hugo Awards for Best Novel of the Year, which puts her top with, I believe, Ray Bradbury. She and Ray Bradbury share the crown of the most best fantasy or science fiction books of the year. Yeah, definitely worth checking out. And apologies, I haven't got anything particularly helpful to say on it, but I will take your recommendation. Martin S. Would it be possible for a being with incredibly great magic, like a Vala or a Top Maya, to simply sever the link between a Nazgul and their ring, thereby causing the Nazgul to die in the way of men? It's an interesting one. I think the implication is that it is possible to sever the link that kept the ring wraith a wraith and in the mortal realm, because that's what happened. When I've gone into this in much greater depth elsewhere, but high level, Merry stabbed the Witch King with his it was sword for him, and that we're told that was what severed the link effectively. Tolkien doesn't quite use those words, but severed the link that kept the Witch King bound to the mortal plane. How did that happen? Well, he was using a sword that they found in the Barrow Downs, or Tom Bombadil gently gave them. He has a bigger influence on this story the more you look into it. Tom Bombadil gave them those swords. They were swords that were buried in the graves of great leaders from what was the Northern Kingdom of Arnor and Cardolan. This is what there, and they were forged in order to be fighting the Witch King's army, which seems to imply that they, back in the day, they had the technology and the magic to be able to forge weapons that undid ring magic. Now, that means that we don't know exactly where they got that technology and magic from, but that means that it was possible. And could a particularly strong person do that? Yes, potentially. So I think, for example, Saruman spent so long studying ring technology, he must have understood how to do that, but we just never really got to see that in action. Let's go to a question from Martin Sjöstrand saying, hello, Robert. Now that The Wheel of Time Season 2 is out, the first 3 episodes anyway, I will ask a question that I asked earlier to see what you think. Basically, it's a sort of comparison to Game of Thrones or A Song of Ice and Fire. I think that political scheming of the Game of Thrones kind does occur, where they call it the Game of Houses. It's just a lot less central to the overall plot. And this is partly due to the fact that regular noble houses with no magic are relatively weak and unable to challenge the main characters for the most part. The sheer number of magic users might decrease the importance of individual magic users, but I certainly think it increases the overall weight of magic users to the story. If magic users were fewer and weaker in the Wheel of Time world, I think the story dynamic would be quite a bit more similar to Game of Thrones, especially in the Caerhien. We're coming back to Lord of the Rings in just one moment, but I think this is a really interesting question about the nature of fantasy literature. Now, how to use magic users within a world and how the influence of magic is on social structures is hugely important to us believing in a world. What you have in the Wheel of Time is a system where there are a significant number of magic users, and those magic users, some of them attach themselves to certain places, houses, people, and also concentrate their power in one place. And as a result, the powers that are there, the sort of the kingdoms that rise to power, always have magic attached to them. Because if you don't have magic and you come up against somebody with magic, then you're going to lose. That, when you play that across to the world of A Song of Ice and Fire, is overcome or shifted with dragons, because there aren't so many in Westeros, there aren't so many overt magic users. But when you get one family who had dragons, nobody else could stand against them. And so that's how the Targaryens came to power. But broadly speaking, Game of Thrones Book 1 presents itself as a low fantasy world with not much by way of magic. We get huge magic in the prologue. Oh, there's the others. What's going on here? Zombies. Huge magic in the last few sentences of the last chapter. Well, dragons are being born. You get one other random chapter with Bran. Apart from that, no magic. And all of the characters we're told to think of as being wise Maester Lewin, Tyrion, they mock the idea of magic. So that's how and why we have this political game going on, because there is no magic. If you take this across to the world of the Lord of the Rings, what Tolkien has done effectively is we've got magical items and we've got magical creatures, but in terms of pure magic users, they're really quite limited. We get the 5 Astari, and that's they're basically synonymous with you're the wizards. Are there others around there? Well, yes, there are other magic users, but not as strong. And so the powers that be in the land, when you get to the world of the Lord of the Rings, are not particularly attached to each of these individual magic users, because there just aren't as many in the world. However, the powerful nations often have attached to them magical items. So the kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor, they had the Palantiri, the magical seeing stones, which were hugely important. You can, in a medieval world, to be able to see what's going on and understand what's going on in your kingdom, massively important. To be able to communicate with people over vast differences, massively important. So yes, magic is there, but it works in a slightly different way. Okay, let's go to question from Travis. My question is in regards to canonicity. There seems to be, to me at least, a bit of a preoccupation with the idea of what is canon and what isn't within Tolkien's work. I've always found this odd, as The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings have built-in uncertainty with the writing conceit that Tolkien used, namely that the Red Book of Westmarch, and I sort of touched on this a bit ago actually, the Red Book of Westmarch was firstly written by unreliable narrators, Bilbo and Frodo. Secondly, was passed down through the ages and revised a few times along the way. And thirdly, subsequently translated into modern English by Tolkien. We actually see Tolkien use this conceit as a clever way to justify the changes in various editions, specifically with regards to the riddles in the dark. Given this, is canonicity a useful conversation to have with regards to Tolkien's work? Should we take The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings as a true account of what happened? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that, or the topic of canonicity more broadly. So canonicity, when it comes to Tolkien's works, is quite a complex issue, to be honest, because there are only 2 books that were published during his lifetime, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and the appendices to The Lord of the Rings. So you could say, well, those are canon, but then you can, and everything else isn't. But then you can go both directions, inwards or outwards, to sort of like add extra layers of confusion to this. Because as you say, even within those stories that we have, we're told on more than one occasion that things might not be exactly as they're being presented. Now, we shouldn't get this wrong and say that Tolkien is presenting a purely subjective kind of postmodern view of what it is. That's not at all what's going on here. But the classic example that you hint at there is that we had the first editions of The Hobbit had a very clear description of how Bilbo got the ring. Then Tolkien later started writing The Lord of the Rings and decided that ring's actually more important. So I'm just going to go, and I'm going to make a video about this at some point. I'm just going to go back and rewrite a section of The Hobbit. And so later editions had a different version. He changed it. And then in world, he even has Gandalf talking about how Bilbo first of all talked about one thing, but when he pressed him on it, he came out and admitted the truth about what had happened. He hadn't been given the ring. He had actually taken the ring. So yes, in world, we shouldn't take what we read as being necessarily 100%. And Tolkien himself, when you read his correspondence, you find that the way that he writes two people, when they're asking about such and such a thing, he will take on the role of being this person who discovered these ancient manuscripts, and someone will say, what happened to the Entwives? And he will go, well, I mean, we don't really know for sure. I suppose what could have happened was this or that. And it's just like, okay, so you're not actually actively answering the question as J.R.R. Tolkien, the human. You're answering in a role of a scholar who's got various bits of information there, and there are massive gaps in what he has got. So that's one way. The other thing we have to add in is, of course, how big do we make the canon? Because we've got those two, but then also we've got the Silmarillion, 3 of the big stories from the Silmarillion, Fall of Gondolin, Children of Húrin, Beren, and Luthien. They have all also, again by Christopher Tolkien, been turned into specific books. We've got Unfinished Tales, which is amazing. We've got 12 official, edited by Christopher Tolkien, History of Middle-earth books, which again are fantastic. But the more you dig into all of this, are these canon? I guess they are, but the more you dig into it, the more you find that Tolkien himself changed his mind on things. He shifted a lot, where this was not just like he wrote a story and that's it. This was a lifetime's work that he shifted and changed his ideas on over time. Balrogs, his concept of Balrogs changed dramatically from when he was first writing about them to the end. You ask the question in Unfinished Tales, there's a great chapter all about Galadriel and Celeborn in the Second and Third Age, and basically it starts with Christopher Tolkien throwing up his hands in the air and saying, we don't know, because we've got all of these conflicting bits of information, things that Tolkien wrote. We've got, here's half a story he wrote there, here's something that he crossed out and then scribbled something else slightly illegible to its side. Here's something that he wrote but then rubbed out. Here's half a thought he'd scribbled onto the back of an exam paper, or it's trying to pull these things together and figure out what actually is Tolkien canon, and it's really hard. So what Christopher Tolkien generally did was he tried, where he could, he put it all together into one cohesive story or bit of information for us. But where that wasn't possible, he would just show, well, we've got this and we've got this, so it could be either of them. So canonicity, I think what I'm saying is that when people say it's clear what Tolkien said on such and such, a lot of the time, deeper you get into this, a lot of the time it's not. And what we have and what we think of as Tolkien's writings is actually a lot more nuanced. And it's very clear that he changed, or he was open to the idea that this would change through time. I heard a fantastic lecture not too long ago, which was talking through, and the lecture was from, I forget her name, she's from the University of Glasgow. Feel free to look her up. And she'd done some research into interviews that Tolkien had given, which nobody had really done before. During his lifetime, newspaper interviews, maybe going on the radio, that kind of thing. And she found these recordings of him when he's giving an interview, and somebody would ask him, about conjugating a certain verb, and then he'd start doing it in a language that he made up, and he'd start doing it, and then he'd pause, and then he'd change his mind about something halfway through and say, no, I don't think I'll do that. I think I'll change it to such and such. And through his life, he was changing things. He was constantly morphing and shifting them. So this is quite a long-winded way of coming around to say canonicity is a really hard thing when it comes to Tolkien. So where do I stand on it? I think we just enjoy what we have, and we have the stories we've got. We value hugely the scholarship of someone like Christopher Tolkien, but that's it. Reflective Rambling actually picking up a question from Mathieu saying, could you describe the evolution of Balrogs and Tolkien's vision for us unknowing souls? Yes, absolutely. I'm very happy to do this. This is a good example of this. So when to start this, let's just sort of clarify Tolkien's idea. He created this world, and the first bits of story that he was writing about were things like the fall of Gondolin and Elendil's journey and things like that. And it took him decades just slowly putting this all together. Pardon me. The stories of The Hobbit and then The Lord of the Rings, we often view them as being the main bits of Tolkien's literature. But for him, these were just like a couple of random stories that just like fed off from this wider world that he had been creating for literally all of his life. And so when you go back and you start reading things like the Silmarillion, which is largely earlier writings, but he did sort of update it, you find with Balrogs that you start off when he's writing them, Tolkien treats them almost like foot soldiers in Morgoth's army. So there's I think it's at one point it talks about centuries of Balrogs. So we're talking like hundreds of Balrogs. These are closer to orcs in terms of power. And you get this wonderful concept of Balrogs flying dragons, which is a wonderful idea. But as he goes through in time, he starts to power them up. And these aren't just like created beings of the enemy. He starts to think, well, okay, well, maybe these are, the next sort of step up. And actually they become Maiar. So this is like Gandalf Sauron level. And then he says, well, if they're that powerful, then there can't be that many of them. And so he then thinks, maybe we're down to like 7 or something. There's even one little scribbly note where he suggests maybe there might only be 3 of them. And so by the time we actually get to what we think of as the Balrog, Durin's Bane, he has transformed from the original idea of actually quite a small foot soldier to suddenly this is something that only Gandalf can face, and this foe is beyond all of you. He turns around to the greatest other heroes in Middle Earth, and he says, no, you can't deal with it, only I can deal with it, because we're on a level. And that's what you see, is that they fight each other, and it's basically a draw, because yes, Gandalf wins, he kills the Balrog, but the Balrog also kills him. It's just that Gandalf gets to come back. They fight for a long time, and it's a draw because they are at equal power levels. So that's that's the evolution of Balrogs. And as I say, I think his last thoughts on it were, there may be only 3, and they're Maiar, hugely powerful. Right, let's go to, there's a Darkstar also asked a related question, which is, do I see myself as a purist when a story is done, no one else should touch it? Or if you think people should be allowed to build on the works like the Rings of Power or Star Wars franchise did? Just as an addition to explain why I'm asking, can you imagine George R. R. Martin not writing A Song of Ice and Fire, but instead just placing his stories in Middle Earth? What is your general point in this? Are you a purist who says hands off the originals, keep it clean, or do you enjoy it if big, well-known works of entertainment get expanded with new ideas, even if it means to possibly damage the reputation by tainting it with subpar additions? Okay. I do get asked this in lots of different ways, and an example I think I might have even used it in my last live stream. But an example of my general attitude to this, I love music as well as books and stories. And it's like, I just think if I've got a favorite song and then someone does a cover version of it, now I might love or hate that cover version. I might be a bit meh about that cover version. I might go, well, what's that? You've just picked off a little bit of the chorus, or maybe a bass line or something. But is that it? My attitude to that is, well, the original's still there. This hasn't changed anything. Some people might like that, and that's great. And in fact, maybe some people will listen to the cover version and go, oh yeah, I'll try listening to that other song as well, the original. And that's also great. So that's my general overall view, is that I don't think there's this sort of tainting of the original. I've never really understood, because the original is still there. You can make as many adaptations of the Lord of the Rings as you like, and they've made quite a few now. If you go back over it, there's been quite a few adaptations of the Lord of the Rings for not just in films, but also radio plays. There's a stage play. There's lots of different interpretations of it, and some you might love, some you might hate, but the original's still there. And so this idea that you kind of taint it in some way, it's just like, no, you can always come back to the original. So that's my overall view on it. I think there's a danger of oversaturation of subpar things in a franchise that I think we've seen a couple of times recently with various different big franchises out there. So I think that's definitely an issue. I think that if you adapt anything from, say, a book to TV, then it will have to have changes made to it. I think we have to accept that there have to be, right down from the actor who's best at acting this role does not look particularly like that character, to these things that we're describing here in the book just do not work on screen. We have to show some things on screen that weren't described in the book. All of those things, you have to make adaptations in order to have an adaptation. So I'm quite relaxed about that kind of thing. And as I say, when it comes to adaptations of books that I like, I tend to think this might even draw people in. I know there are people watching here now, for example, with the Rings of Power, which I don't know whether this is one of the things that prompted the question. I know people who have watched and enjoyed the Rings of Power, and as a result, they have read The Lord of the Rings, the book. Sales of the book of The Lord of the Rings went up hugely during Peter Jackson's movies. They've gone up again hugely during the Rings of Power. It brings people to the original. There's no need to defend it, in my humble view. But you did ask, in the middle of that, you asked, can you imagine George R. R. Martin not writing A Song of Ice and Fire, but instead just placing his stories in Middle Earth? And I think my answer to that is no, I cannot, because, I mean, I could imagine him writing stories in Middle Earth. I'm sure he would write some excellent stories in Middle Earth, but A Song of Ice and Fire would not work in Middle Earth. It requires its own universe. It requires its own universe with its own laws and its own background and its own history, and that's what makes it work. That we're straight away with A Song of Ice and Fire, we're faced with why are the seasons out of balance? That's not a question you could ask in Middle Earth. And you're faced with who are the others and where did they come from? That would not fit with the world of Tolkien's Legendarium. So yes, George R. R. Martin, I'm sure, could write fantastic fiction within Middle Earth, but I don't think he could have written A Song of Ice and Fire in Middle Earth. Martin S. saying, silly question, if Manwë sent Tulkas to fight in the Battle of Pelennor Fields, what thought would pass through the Witch King's invisible to most people's head? Tulkas, for those who don't know, he's one of the Valar, great fighter, great laugher, great hunter. If he went to fight in the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, then yeah, the Witch King, as arrogant as he is, I think would be forced to recognize that this is somebody above his pay grade. Reflective Rambling saying, example, had no clue that Johnny Cash did not originate Hurt, and I stand by Placebo and within temptations take on running up that hell, in fact, listen to them more. Well, the interesting thing with Hurt, this is digression, we'll come back to Lord of the Rings, just 1 second. With Hurt, the song Hurt, which is amazing, the Johnny Cash version, if you've never heard it, brilliant. The lead singer of Nine Inch Nails, who wrote the song, whose name escapes me for this moment, he said when he heard Johnny Cash's version that song was no longer his own, it was now Johnny Cash's, and he had no right trying to write that song as a younger man, because that song is about somebody looking back on their life, and so Johnny Cash's interpretation was there, and it was brilliant. Okay, Trent Reznor, thank you very much indeed. Let's go with a question from Callie Summers, saying, I hope your week has been fantastic. It's not been too bad, thank you. I have a couple of creature-related questions for you. If my memory serves, during the Einar Lindale, there were beings of equivalent power to the Valar and Maiar who did not participate in the shaping of the world or enter into air at the beginning of time. Tolkien liked his categories and subcategories, so is it possible that other Ainur entered the world later? They wouldn't technically be Valar or Maiar, but able to exert influence if they wished. Bombadil, Goldberry, Ungoliant, the Watcher in the Water, some of the original dragons, the nameless things, perhaps. At the other end of this... Oh, actually, I'll answer the second part of this question in just a moment. Is it possible that there are other Ainur-type creatures who've entered into Middle-earth? Well, yes. For those who don't know, so Einar Lindale, we're talking about the music of the Ainur. This is the creation, basically, of Middle-earth, of the whole planet, Arden. And the great god Eru Iluvatar gets all of his lackeys, is the wrong word, gets all of the Ainur, the Valar, the Maiar, they all basically singing into existence creation. So that's what's going on. And then afterwards, he says, you were doing this, the actual thing is happening over here. Who wants to go down? And some of them put up their hands, and those are the ones that we know of. This is where these higher beings, as it were, who are in Arda, this is who they are. Might a few others have kind of snuck in without anyone knowing? Well, I think the clear implication is yes. I think Ungoliant is a perfect example of this. The point here, though, I think, is that Tolkien, you're right, he loves his categorizations. He loves explaining exactly how all these different things fit in together. If you just look at the different categorizations of elves, your mind blows because of quite how many different breakdowns they are, how many different groups there were. But he also, and I love him for this, he also drops in things that are not explained, which is what actually makes the world feel a whole lot more real. Because if everything was easily categorized and known, then it wouldn't be scary. There wouldn't be everything would just sort of go along on a pattern. But you have characters like Tom Bombadil and Goldberry. You have Ungoliant, who you can't 100% be sure how powerful they are, why they're doing what they're doing. And that just adds this extra layer. So, yes, some of those at least, I think, were part of the original Ainur who were there, who kind of like snuck in and joined Arda. Not all of them. I'm not going to get into a digression about Tom Bombadil here and now, but I think Tom Bombadil's something slightly different going on there. Right, let's go. Oh, and the second part of that was, what's the deal with the thrush in The Hobbit? The men of Lake Town could speak their language, sure, but this one little bird happened to overhear Bilbo mention Smaug's weak spot, and then found Lake Town who could understand the language and had the skill to hit the target. Was this thrush serving Manwë or Eru? It feels too random to qualify as a eucatastrophe, but how would you explain it in universe, rather than just Tolkien needed a way for Bard to get the information? So for those who need a little reminder, this is what the situation is in The Hobbit. We get Bilbo has basically discovered there's this little patch that is the weak spot for Smaug. Now, what are they going to do with that information? Not huge amounts about in that particular time, but Smaug has awoken. He's headed off. He's going to attack Lake Town. This thrush hears this and then flies off to Lake Town, appears next to Bard, who is there about to shoot his last arrow, and says, "Aim just there." And Bard does, and he kills Smaug. Now, said like that, yes, this seems just a little bit too coincidental. So I think we need to give a little bit of the background here. So a thrush here this isn't just a random bird that happens to be there. These were talking birds who used to be friends with, work with the people of Dale, the people who the humans who lived in and around and just outside the mountain kingdom of Erebor. Now, they could understand and they could also speak to people. Now, their language, Tolkien did even come up with a name for the language, of course he did. Their language was understandable by these lords of Dale. So these are intelligent birds. They were used basically as sort of for carrying messages around. If you think about, a bit like the ravens in A Song of Ice and Fire, but like the old ones, that they were supposed to be intelligent enough to memorize messages and fly from one place to another. That's the kind of idea we've got. So not just a normal bird. It gets the information. Smaug flies off, and it goes and it finds Bard, who we'd not really heard much of before this point, but then he goes, finds Bard. Bard can understand and fires. Isn't that a bit much that it went straight to Bard? Well, first of all, we don't know it went straight to Bard. This thrush could have gone around half a dozen people giving information, and it's only when it got to Bard, and we only read about it when it gets to Bard. So that's the first point. The second point is that if the thrush had just arrived, when you read that situation, Lake Town is aflame. There's just this small circle that are still holding out against the dragon. Smaug, we read, is enjoying himself, just scaring these. He's toying with them. He's so proud. He's not even just thinking, I'm going to destroy everything. He's toying with them. And we get this one small company of archers left. These are the only ones who are there. And their leader is Bard. So the thrush comes in, sees Lake Town aflame, sees there's only one possible hope for killing this dragon, and it's Bard. So that's an in-world explanation for why. But there's also another thing going on here, which is Bard will be important after the battle. And one thing which will be important after the battle is the fact that he can be a representative of his people, because he is a direct descendant of, I think it was Girion was his direct descendant, the Lord of Dale. And that gave him some negotiating rights when it came to talking to the dwarves. And this gets introduced by the fact that he understands this language, which is not just a language that randomly people can understand. This is the language that the lords, the nobility, it would appear, of Dale understood. So there is a clear and strong in-world reason, as well as a sort of a more this is what Tolkien was trying to achieve with it reason. Connor Palachek saying, hello, hi. Question on Arnor. Can you give a quick overview on the establishment of the realm? I'm not as familiar with it pre-Witch King. Also, just joined Patreon. Stoked to be part of the community. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. And give perfect opportunity for me. Always try and do this. Patrons, thank you for your support. I hugely appreciate it. If you do want to support this channel, Patreon is the best way to do it. I'm sure if you're watching live, the mods will put a link up in the chat right now. I'll make sure that there's a link down in the description as well. And also there will be a link appearing at the end of the stream. So patrons, thank you, and moderators, while we're here, the other thank you I always try and do, if you are watching this live, the reason why the chat is such an amazing place is because the moderators do an amazing job. So if you could just show them a little bit of love in the chat, I would hugely appreciate that. But to this question, a quick overview on the establishment of the realm. I'm not as familiar with it pre-Witch King. Yes, so Arnor was established in the wake of the fall of Numenor. We had basically, now how many ships were there? Always forget the exact number. I think there were 9 ships who of the faithful who set out. They had with them the 7 seeing stones, the 7 Palantiri. There was Elendil and his 2 sons, and basically the northern kingdom, they got split. This small ragtag fleet got split, which you can understand and accept. An entire island continent just gets smashed, waves going over it. There was a huge storm. The ships got separated and went to different places. So the brothers ended up down in what we now know as Gondor. They established the southern kingdom there, and then we had Elendil, who got washed up further up in Middle Earth, and he sets himself up in the north. And it's 2 kingdoms, but they can have contact with each other because they've got these Palantiri, these seeing stones. He sets up the kingdom. It's not there for hugely long. When Sauron basically declares himself again, and so the last alliance happens. When the last alliance happens, the last man standing out of the kings is Isildur. And so Isildur heads back. He hangs around for about a year. He heads back up north. He is going to take over as High King. He heads back up north. He obviously doesn't make it, but his son does. And from then, the Northern Kingdom is established. Now, the Northern Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom, yes, they're 2 separate kingdoms, and theoretically we've got a High King in the north. But the problem is distance and separation between the 2. Which we have the Misty Mountains, which go right up and down the middle of Middle Earth, cutting off one side from another. The only way through is through what we think of now as the Gap of Rohan. They build a road, the Great North-South Road, often became later known as the Greenway, which joined up the 2 kingdoms, but ultimately they were just too far away from each other. So I hope that gives you sort of an overview of what happened. And up in the north, Angmar, when we're talking about the Witch King of Angmar, he wasn't known as that until after the foundation of Arnor. He sets it as his mission to destroy, first of all, the Northern Kingdom. And so he sets himself up in Angmar, which is just off the top of the Misty Mountains and close to where Arnor is. And then for centuries, he just attacks, divides them with politics. He sends plagues. There's all manner of things, and he sets that as his mission. And eventually the kingdom breaks down into 3 because of internal division. The fact that they're separate means that it was easier for him, the Witch King, to take on one and then another, and then finally all 3 fell. That's quite a potted history there of the Northern Kingdom of Arnor. Right, let's go with question from Diego Godoy saying, "Hola, Robert. Hola. Would you ever consider covering the Expanse books? I'd also love to get your takes on a more sci-fi story, like you did some time ago with Black Mirror or Westworld. Yeah, there's only Westworld's obviously now finished. I covered that for a couple of seasons, and I think I did one video on Black Mirror. So yeah, I love sci-fi as well. It is just a matter of time, how much time I have to devote to things. I'm doing a little bit of magic behind the scenes to try and free myself up to have a little bit more time to be creating content. For the next little bit, it will remain the two big things I cover, Lord of the Rings and A Song of Ice and Fire, plus the third, The Witcher. I really enjoy The Witcher. And there's lots of new Witcher stuff coming out soon, it has to be said. 2 spin-offs are in the works. Andrei Sapkowski said he is writing another Witcher book, which is exciting, and also lots more stuff in the video game sphere. We're getting the first Witcher game is being remastered, and we've got completely new Witcher games coming on as well. So lots going on there. When I have extra time, yes, I'd love to cover some more stuff. The 2 things that are always top of my mind in this are the Wheel of Time and Dune. So those will probably be the first things I cover when I have more time to expand into other areas. As for the Expanse, now I have tried with the Expanse with the TV show. I'm sure I've said this before a long time ago. Lots of people who I know and respect and value their judgment have told me that I will love the Expanse, both the TV show and the books. I will admit I've not had the time to get around to read the books. The TV show I tried 3 times and never really got into it. So I'd love to. Maybe I will try the books, and maybe that will help me with the TV show. We'll see. Let's go to Martin S. saying, I saw a Star Wars video saying that Emperor Palpatine was originally a corrupt politician, not a Sith. If Lucas stuck to that, Episode 3 would have to be different. He'd have no chance when fighting Mace Windu or Yoda. Yeah, I mean, Palpatine clearly was a Sith. I love Star Wars. I really do. I watch pretty much everything. But Star Wars, but I'm not a lore expert. But yeah, definitely it's central to the plot, as I understand it, that Palpatine is definitely a Sith primarily, who has got himself into a position of power rather than the politician who then got corrupted. People in the chat talking about Girl Next Gondor, who is indeed great. I would have to agree with that, and I think she's started making content again, which would be wonderful. So reflective rambling saying, for a moment I thought you said Adrian Tchaikovsky, and no, I didn't. I mean, there are many talented Tchaikovskys in the world. No, Andrei Sapkowski. It may well just be my poor pronunciation. Let's go to actually talking about Andrei Sapkowski. We've got 2 or 3 Witcher questions now. We've got some more Lord of the Rings after that, but let's do these. 444 saying, Andrei Sapkowski, in a recent interview with the Ukrainian fans, said that he is writing a new Witcher book, which he expects to finish within 1 year. Non-Polish readers will need to wait a bit longer for translation. This is exciting news, as I thought he was done with The Witcher. Personally, I would love to read some new short stories set before, after, and in the time of the saga, but my best guess is some standalone novel like Season of Storms during the timeline of the shorter stories. What are my thoughts? Well, yes, he did confirm this quite recently, that he is writing another Witcher story. I think he has confirmed that it is going to be a novel. He's definitely said he think he'll be done in a year. He didn't say how far into it he is. What else did he say in that interview? Well, let me just say for the sort of the context for those who aren't as up to speed with the Witcher books, there's 2 books of short stories which were published independently, and then he's pulled them together into 2 sets of short stories that, if you saw the Witcher TV show very broadly, that's the period of the first season, and they did cover a few of those short stories. Then we've got a 5-book saga, starting with Blood of Elves, which, again, very roughly, although they didn't stick very closely to it, but very roughly was season 2 of the timeline of season 2 of The Witcher. Then he put all that down, and The Witcher became a success while he wasn't writing any more of it. We got the video games. There's been it was called The Hexer, I think, a TV show in Poland. Then obviously we get the TV show on Netflix. He did write, a few years ago, he wrote A Season of Storms, which is a standalone novel, which is very... The timelines, he left it deliberately vague, but it's sort of set during the time of the short stories. So I think he's confirmed that this will be a novel, again, set roughly during the time of the short stories, rather than in his main story arc or what happens after, which, for people who care about the timeline of these things, the 3 Witcher video games are set after the end of the Witcher saga, the 5-book series. So what are my thoughts? Yeah, I'm excited. It's quite rare that a new book comes out in the kinds of things that I'm covering. Feel free to insert your own Winds of Winter joke here, but a new Witcher book will be absolutely fantastic. I cannot wait for that. In terms of translation, I have a feeling, given the global success of The Witcher, I have a feeling that they might now hold on to it for a little bit so that it can get a Polish and English translation happening at the same time as the Polish original. I suspect that's what will happen. And yeah, it's all good. Now, follow-up question from 444 is about the TV show. Season 3 of The Witcher is now done, she says. In Poland, people are widely disappointed. Meanwhile, there are reports of declining viewership, not only season to season, from episode to episode. There's another troubled spin-off, this time about the rats, with reports claiming that filming wrapped in just under 2 months instead of the at least 5 planned. Strange and unfortunate statements from writers and producers. And last but not least, Henry Cavill's departure. Back in 2019, this was a big hit and the first big fantasy series after Game of Thrones ended. What went wrong with the series? So big questions. So I should probably start this by saying that I enjoyed season 3. I thought it was a big step up from season 2. I thought there was a degree of irony in the fact that the bits of season 3 that people seemed to dislike the most were the bits that probably stuck closest to the book. For example, that episode when Ciri's out there in the desert, it's not exactly like in the book, but it's pretty close. And so I was expecting at the end, after season 3, to be feeling a little bit deflated if they were going even further away from it, but they seem to have kind of pulled it back around again. So I'm now feeling actually relatively optimistic. So the critiques that you have come up with, absolutely valid. Viewing numbers are down. I would add as a sort of a counter to that the context for that is that The Witcher season 1 was one of the biggest and most successful things that Netflix ever did. It's even now, 4 years later, they just recently published their list of their most watched things ever. It's still up there in their top 20, and it's just below massive hits like Squid Game or Bridgerton or Stranger Things. So it's still up there. And when season 3 happened, season 1 and season 2 went right back up into their top 10 again, both of them. So this is still doing good for them. The numbers are down, but this isn't in disaster territory by any stretch of the imagination. The Rats, this is a spin-off. This is again it's hard to see exactly what's going on because they have kept this very quiet, but this feels odd. There's a spin-off. You saw the Rats got introduced right at the end of season 3. They're basically a group of teen rebels and outlaws who, when you read the books, it's a really dark storyline. These are a lot of really quite unpleasant characters. And they announced that they were going to do a spin-off of the Rats, that everything we were told suggested this was going to be a proper mini-series. They'd mapped it out for 5 or more months of filming, and then they made a sudden announcement after 2 months, that's it, they're done. And it's like, well, that seems a little bit weird. I'm sure there's a story there. We do not know the story, but that's what's going on. So I'm waiting to hear more about that. They've done 2 spin-offs so far. I thought Nightmare of the Wolf, the anime, was pretty good, actually. I thought it was all right. The Blood Origin, I really didn't like, I have to say. That also had a very troubled production. So what's gone wrong is the question. I'm just sort of talking around it, but what's gone wrong? Well, I think it's not gone as badly as I think some press seems to try and suggest that it has. It's still a massive hit for them. And as I said, I think season 3 pulled the quality back up again. But I don't think there's any doubt that this has, as a production, it has not been managed as smoothly as, say, most of the HBO productions. There have been leaks left, right, and centre about what's going on. There's been lots of reshoots. There's been lots of changes of direction. So I'm not in the production and I can't really comment on what it is. So I'm just going to say I think that there's a lot of issues that have just swirled around this, which have just troubled it. And I feel that they've lost a lot of what made the original season 1 worked so well, because it was not trying to be anything in particular. It was just trying to tell the stories. And if they can bring themselves back to that, I've got a lot of hope. The issue is, for those who've read the books, you will know that further on into the books, that the style of telling the stories changes hugely. And this is no longer just a straight, easily told story with our little Witcher family all getting on together. They have huge problems ahead, I think, and they will have to change the way they deliver it. So maybe that change will be for the better, but I think it will definitely make it more challenging. Reflective ramblings. I think this is picking up a question for impending inspiration. Thank you very much. Tolkien was clearly inspired by music. In what ways did he draw direct inspiration from his favorite pieces or composers? Well, I don't know about his direct inspiration from his favorite pieces or composers. I'll have to pass on that. That's the kind of thing that I have a feeling that there will be people in the chat who are cleverer than me on that. What I can do, though, is talk a little bit about how central music is within Tolkien's world. Now, the music of the Ainur, we talked about this a bit earlier. This is basically the universe got sung into existence. This is the same again. I talked about C.S. Lewis earlier. That happens with Narnia. It gets sung into existence. And so this idea of music and singing is there right from the very beginning. This is a song. And you get characters who get who are most in tune with the world are filled with songs. You get Tom Bombadil can almost hardly stop singing. He is there as much as anything. He's like sort of, we won't go into Tom Bombadil in detail, but he is an expression of Middle Earth in a way, and he sings all the time. The hobbits are forever singing, and we know that they're very connected in with their land, their local environment. The elves do lots of singing. We don't hear so much of the bad guys singing. Singing is about joy in Tolkien's world, and sorrow, and bringing out what's true in ourselves. And I think that is at the heart of where all of this is. It's probably, just to summarize this position we have, is that the one thing that almost everyone, they read the Lord of the Rings for the first time, the one thing almost everyone says is there's more songs than I was expecting. There's more poems than I was expecting. You go to the Council of Elrond and they're stopping every few minutes for a song or a poetry recital or something. This is absolutely central to his understanding of his world. So, I mean, I don't know. I'll try and pick up in the chat. I'll have a look in a moment whether there's any specific pieces or composers that he loved. But yeah, it was definitely central. People asking me about Outlander. No, I've not read the Outlander series at all. I mean, I hear only good things about it, but have a limited amount of time, sadly. Charis Ballerina. Does Eru curse the elves and dwarves to feud when he speaks to Aula and blesses the dwarves and gives them sapience, or is he just seeing the future? I think this is just seeing the future. It's not I don't think Eru the perfect high god is there sort of cursing these two groups of people to be ever killing each other. That's not what's happening, but he does see that this will create friction. So it's an acknowledgement, and he could prevent it, but he allows the free will, not just the free will of the dwarves and the elves, but also he allows the free will from Aula, who created the dwarves. So yeah, I don't think it was a curse so much as a prophecy. If Eru is outside of time, and so it's more okay, so just so you know, this is going to happen kind of feel, rather than okay, because you did this, I'm now cursing them, because it wasn't the dwarves and elves' fault that they got created. You could blame Aula, but Aula clearly he realized that he overstepped the mark and came back very humbly afterwards. So no, if you were to suggest that this is a curse, you have to say that what happened is that he is cursing innocent people for the sins of someone else. Nikolai Monson saying, hey man, love all your content, keep up the great work. Thank you. My question is in Fellowship. What were those wolves that when killed left no bodies? Thanks. So I'm not 100% sure which specific thing you're talking about here, but you're probably talking about the wogs. So the wogs are a type of, actually I've got some point I will release a video I've got almost made about the difference between wolves, werewolves and wogs, and why it matters. But basically wogs are wolves, but they're more intelligent, and they were basically bred probably by Morgoth, and to the extent that when we get the Battle of the Five Armies, one of the five armies is actually the wogs. That's how Tolkien views them, as an army in and of themselves. They're not just like things that the orcs or goblins ride on occasionally. They're a separate sentient army in and of themselves. So yeah, that's almost certainly, I think, what you're talking about there. Oh, yeah, Charis Ballerina pointing at Wagner, of course. The ring cycle, Wagner's ring cycle, is definitely something that Tolkien was aware of, and I don't know how to sort of put it, whether it's paying homage to, stealing. He took a lot of inspiration from a lot of different things, and yet definitely the ring cycle is a part of that. Think that's me caught up in the chat. Let's go to question from Maura Lee. Yeah, one more question about the Witcher, saying, how do you think the showrunners will explain the change in actors playing Geralt? During the Matrix movies, the way the showrunners explained the change in actresses who played the Oracle was to put the blame on the Merovingian. Right, so this is something they were asked, and this is they gave a clear-ish answer, or at least they told us of their approach to it. And this is one of those things where, depending on how much faith you have in them, you can either find what they say incredibly reassuring or a little bit uncertain making. Now, what they could have done, let's be clear, the easiest option is just to ignore it. They can just carry on, and they just introduce a new actor. It's like the James Bond kind of thing. A new James Bond appears. They look a bit different. They sound a bit different. They might act a little bit different, but it's still James Bond. And we're all just expected to just sort of shrug our shoulders and carry on and suspend our disbelief. Okay, this is now what James Bond looks like. They could have done that. They could have decided to start season 4 and just carried on without acknowledging it. That's one option. The other easy-ish way out that they could have done is at the end of season 3, Geralt gets injured, very seriously injured. And he also has a really significant shift in character, which... sometimes you pick up on these things even more the second time through you watch. But he was a Witcher all the way through seasons 1 to 3. He was a Witcher who's very, very much focused on this idea of neutrality. I'm not picking sides in these wars between humans. We saw that in season 3 as well. We saw him there just sort of like sitting in the corner while everybody in the aftermath of the ball, while it was all kicking off. At the end of season 3, he changes his mind. Ciri has been taken, as far as he is aware. Ciri has been taken to Emir. Vilgefortz is involved. He is now the enemy of Emir and Vilgefortz. And we see this when he manages to get his way past the sentries, and then he turns around and just kills them. Old Geralt would have just carried on. He turns around and kills them, and he leaves behind that the thing he's basically been having as a sort of good luck charm, the Renfrey's little necklace thing. He leaves that behind. That was to remind him. He carried that around as a reminder of the need for neutrality, of what happens when you get caught up in infighting between humans. So they could have said all of this change. He gets magically healed. He changes character somewhat, and this is the new actor. They could have done that, but they haven't. What they have done, as I say, this well, I'll explain it, and then you can draw your own conclusions whether you're happy with it or not. What they say is, and this is right, the later books start to introduce a lot more of a meta understanding of the idea of telling story. And they introduce the concept of different times and worlds. We're not just living on the continent in this one Witcher world. There's a much bigger set of worlds going on out there, and the way that we tell the story does shift. And this is a big theme, particularly of the later books, is what is the truth of the story, and how much does it matter? We often see the same scene from one person's perspective, then we hear about it from somebody else, then we read a report about it from somewhere else, then we get a song about it, and it's like, well, what actually happened, and how much does it matter when we've got these different aspects? And they have said, this it wasn't the showrunner, it was one of the producers, have said that they've decided that the way they're going to tackle this change in actor is to play into this idea more of a meta understanding of storytelling. Not, it has to be said, like the MCU with Marvel, where you get like a metaverse and you get lots of different versions of Spider-Man, and so this is just a different version of Spider-Man. They're not going down that route, but they are going to try and do something clever with perhaps telling the story in a different way. Perhaps they will get they had that character Minnie Driver as the elf character who appeared in Blood Origin, was telling stories. Perhaps she'll suddenly appear and start telling the story of Geralt from a slightly different perspective, and so to reflect that, we have a slightly different looking Geralt. They haven't given us the details yet, but I am heartened by the fact that they clearly understand that the book's focus starts to shift, and it is starting to focus in on this concept of story as one of the key elements and drivers of the narrative. But it's quite a hard thing to pull off. So I'm holding judgment until I see it. I'm heartened and yet a little bit nervous at the same time. Okay, let's go to a question from Rika de Vries saying, "Good avond, Robert." I suspect I've completely mispronounced that. Is it Dutch? Perhaps. How are you doing? Can you talk about the Grey Company? I'd love to know a bit more about them. Love all your work. Greetings from Holland. Yes. So Dutch. Good. Yes. Although what I might do, I'd like to give this a full answer next time, if that's okay. I will give you an overview now, but I think this is the kind of thing where I will do a bit of research, because I was thinking of doing a video on this. So I'll give you a fuller version next time, if you don't mind me coming back to it. But yeah, so we get, the idea is that we get the Grey Company is... Actually, I'll start a little bit earlier. So we go back. Aragorn, we know, is a Dunedain ranger, and he's not alone. There's a lot of them out there. He's the chieftain, the leader, the king in exile. But in and around this also, we kind of have a few other people who do the same kind of thing. The thing they do is they're patrolling those lands. They used to be Arnor. They have kept to their word, what they feel is their duty, to be protecting those lands. In particular, it's the Shire, where there are obviously still hobbits living there, protecting from the outside world, because there are still threats out there, and they are keeping that up. They're not alone in doing that. There are others who also take on this role, sometimes more actively than others. Elladan and Elrohir, the twin sons of Elrond, are also like that, as are some others of the elves out of Rivendell, and a few other handy people hanging around. So what happens is that Aragorn basically just sort of like, he's doing all of his good stuff there up in the north, but then every now and then he sort of dips off to do something else, sometimes for a few years. At one point he goes to Rohan, goes to Gondor when he's younger, goes to Mordor to see the world. Then he meets up with Gandalf, and Gandalf says, we really have to track down Gollum, and so they head off for like 16 years hunting for Gollum. So he keeps on dipping off, and when we get the story happening, he's there, and basically Gandalf has told Aragorn what's going on, and Aragorn dips off because he's now having to look after Frodo. he heads off with the Fellowship down all the way, and eventually he ends up in Rohan with the paths of the about to go on the paths of the dead, and a group of people are basically sent down to help, and advice from Elrond, and it's the Grey Company, which is made up of Eldan, Elbahir, and Dunedain, and possibly a few others, and so they go with Aragorn, and they're basically like his personal, it's not his bodyguard, but they're his team, his Praetorian Guard, who are following him around for this time being. They don't appear on the films, which is a shame, because they wanted to make it just about the three, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, and I understand that. But yes, there's an extra element, and they do some really cool things in the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. But I will come back and talk about that a little bit more perhaps next time. Right, let's go to question from Otis 480. I want to ask you about one thing that's always bothered me in The Lord of the Rings. After the Council of Elrond, the Fellowship stays in Rivendell for 2 months. Why was this long stay necessary? If they could have started a little sooner, they might have been able to pass Caradhras, and all the Balrog business might have been avoided. The hobbits even discussed the issue of setting out in winter with Gandalf, but their arguments do not satisfy me. Is there more to it than what is presented in the text? Has Gandalf perhaps intended to sacrifice himself all along? So, I understand why this does seem a little bit odd. You've made the decision, you're going to go off and destroy the ring. Why not just head off and do it now? Your last question, is there something extra going on here? Like, is Gandalf actually trying to manipulate events to try and make sure that he does sacrifice himself? I don't think any of that's going on. There is always looming over this idea of destiny or fate, which we can't, or the guiding hand of Eru Ilúvatar, if you rather, which we can never discount from this. So they left at the right time for all those things to happen. I think that is very much clear. And also Christmas Day, when they leave. Tolkien liked that. He didn't plan it like that, but he liked that. That's what happened. So why the delay? Well, partly I think it's just because things happen slower in Rivendell. These guys have been living for thousands of years. So this, okay, we've got to wait for another couple of weeks or so. That doesn't bother them so much. Elrond took an age to decide who was going to be in the Fellowship. That's another part of it. But I think the biggest reason, or two biggest reasons, first is that everybody just frankly needed to recover. Yes, Frodo had his surgery, magical healing from Elrond, but everybody needed to be absolutely up to full health. And secondly, information was the biggest issue that they had. A lack of information. They got caught by surprise a little bit by the Black Ride, the Nazgul being out there. This wasn't a tactic that Sauron had really used before, and then suddenly sending his Nazgul out. So what was going on? Where were the wars actually going to be happening? Because whereas we just follow the action and goes down to Minas Tirith, actually there were wars happening all over the place. The Dol Guldur forces attacked northern Mirkwood. They attacked Lothlorien. There was a battle going on up at Erebor, the Lonely Mountain. Lots of things were going on around. They got news of Saruman. Obviously, Gandalf knew that Saruman had turned. They genuinely didn't know what was going on. They had to try and figure it out, and they sent out scouts. They sent scouts out just to see what on earth was happening, because what would have been worse from their perspective, okay, they could wait a month or two and then head off and make sure they're going the right way, rather than going off and suddenly running straight into an army. That would be the worst thing. So they send off scouts to try and find out what's going on, and also to try and find Radagast. They look in for Radagast. Radagast would have been a great ally for them. He is incredibly powerful. He doesn't come across as it, but he is incredibly powerful. So they were looking for Radagast. He couldn't be found. He disappeared. So that's what the delay was. It's sort of, I mean, I think they kind of mapped out and figured that, you know, they probably had enough time, because they had a little bit of wiggle room for the time. So yeah, I think that's it. Firstly, Elrond was taking his time making decisions. Secondly, they wanted everybody healed up. Thirdly, they wanted good information before setting out. Let's go to LOK saying, hello, hope you're well. I am, thank you. I myself am writing this with a broken elbow. Such fun. Ouch. I mean, I hope that heals up as well as it can, as quickly as it can. That doesn't sound very nice at all. Anyway, question. I'm sure I'm not the first to have thought of this, but Balrog wings. Yes, but made of flame rather than flesh, which would explain why they go out when they get wet or weakened by the lack of oxygen, like high up on a mountain. Sorry for bringing it up. I know it's a controversial subject. Well, it is, if you're sort of new to this, Balrog wings is a controversial subject within the nerdy Tolkien community, but it's actually one of those ones where I don't think any side takes it too seriously. It's a fun thing to debate, but we know that we'll never ultimately get a full answer from Tolkien. For those who want to know why on earth are people wondering about Balrog wings, it's because Tolkien's description for them, when we see the Balrog, Durin's Bane, his description is could be interpreted either way. I don't have it in front of me right here, but basically, first of all, it talks about shadow extending like wings out from him. And then a bit later, it talks about its wings stretching out to a certain thing. And it's like, are we still talking about the shadow, or are we actually talking about its wings at this point? And then we get the fact that the Balrog fell all the way down the chasm and then off of a mountain, and seems not to have used wings, which would have been quite useful in both those situations. Similarly, we get when Glorfindel, back in the First Age, killed a Balrog on a mountainside, it died falling off the cliff, which doesn't seem to imply wings. However, when you then if you look at the Peter Jackson films, he got involved in this discussion, and he said he had like proper scholars thinking about this and the rest of it. And then he had his design team created it, just looked cooler with wings. And so that's what he went with. So now in our collective minds, when we think of the Balrog has got wings. So that's the situation, and people debate this to and fro all the time. As I say, just in the nerdiest of corners of Tolkien's world. For me, my slightly tongue-in-cheek response to this is that if they did have wings, they always forgot to use them. So I'm pretty sure they didn't have wings. And I have long and complicated explanations for that, beyond that. But the suggestion here is wings made of flame rather than flesh, which would explain why they go out when they get wet or weakened by the lack of oxygen. So, yeah, I get it's good thinking, lateral thinking. I like it. The wings are described as shadowy when we're in Mordor. So I think that's shadowy rather than flamey. And whereas it was a great visual on the films of Gandalf and the Balrog just sort of falling into a big pool, he could easily have, if he had wings, he could have flapped them and prevented himself from falling into the pool. So I'm not sure that I buy that one. Let's go with, but thank you. It was a great question. Maura Lee asking what I'm looking forward to watching in season 2 of both House of the Dragon and The Rings of Power. Are there any show characters I'm looking forward to seeing again? House of the Dragon, I'm really looking forward to, plot lines as much as anything. The Spy War, which was teased at the end of season 1, which isn't something we get huge amounts of information about in the book, but it absolutely fits with what we got from the book. And also the dragons. We started getting dragon lore in season 1, and I'm waiting for more. Are there more times when the dragons are just not following instructions? Can we learn more about dragon bonding in season 2? Hopefully we can, because we're going to get the dragon seeds happening. So yeah, that's what I'm looking forward to most. In season 2 of Rings of Power, we've got a new actor for Adar, but the character was great. Really good addition, I thought. So I'm really looking forward to seeing where that goes. And also the dwarves. The dwarf storyline didn't really go very far in the Rings of Power. They ended up pretty much in exactly the same spot that they started in. But I thought that the acting, particularly Peter Mullen as the King Durin, I thought that was as good an on-screen portrayal of dwarves as we've had anywhere, I think. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. And also connected to that, Maura says, what do you think the role of dwarves will be in season 2? Or the Harfoots? Will we see the other rings created, including the One Ring? Well, the dwarves, I can say what, according to Tolkien lore, canon, Silmarillion, goes, then the dwarves should already have, so hopefully they will now retrospectively do this, they should already have made friends with the elves of Eregion and built the doors of Durin, the ones that we see in the Lord of the Rings. That should be done in a time of peace, so we'll have to wait and see how that happens, but basically they're a sign of friendship between the dwarves and the elves. The password and the thing is, say friend and enter, speak friend and enter in Elvish. So basically all an elf has to do in order to get into the dwarven stronghold is say, I'm a friend, and then the door opens for them. So that is a sign and a symbol of how close the friendship was. So that should happen. Then when we get, after the rings get forged, which surely they will be in the Rings of Power, Sauron should, his cunning plan doesn't quite work for him, and he should then invade Eriador and basically take out Celebrimbor and all of his buddies, and the dwarves will come out and help defend before turning around and going back in and locking the door. Now, at some point, they will be given one of the Rings of Power. Whether that happens this season or not, I think they're queuing it. The suggestion was they're queuing it up for that. They're playing around a lot with the timelines, with a lot of stuff here, but with the dwarves, particularly with, they were teasing the Balrog, which shouldn't happen until well into the Third Age, so we shouldn't see that. Commander, I'm down to my last couple of questions from my patrons here. So I've got quite a few more questions in the chat to get to. Commander Ray saying, hey, Robert, I like to think about how the One Ring would affect characters from other fictions, and I wanted to get your thoughts on it. Imagine Game of Thrones with Dany with the ring, or Star Wars with Darth Vader wielding it. That would be terrifying. And do you think about the One Ring if you had it, and what would you do? Well, in terms of me, and I don't actually, I can genuinely say I've never thought what I would do if I had the One Ring. But I think that's good because I suspect that starting to try and think what you would do with all of that power is probably exactly what the One Ring would want you to do, and I think it would make Tolkien sad. So, no, I haven't. What about Danny with the One Ring? I mean, I think a lot of the Targaryens, before we got the House of the Dragon reveal about there's this higher purpose for the Targaryens, then I think in terms of sort of defending the people of Westeros and the world against the threat from the others, then I think a lot of the fire and blood conquering an invasion thing for the Targaryens is very One Ring-ish. So I think, yeah, it would just make them more so. As for Darth Vader, I think the only thing that would change there is that Darth Vader would probably wish to be the Emperor himself, not just the Emperor's right-hand man. And yeah, I think it would make him a lot less likely then to get turned at the end, so to speak. Martin S. What prevents the Nazgul from simply flying into Minas Tirith and spreading horror from within the city? Was it Gandalf the White? Interesting question. So this is win the Battle of Pennar Fields. Why didn't they just fly over to Minas Tirith? Well, it's clear that they were just doing as far as I read it anyway, a really basic no chances taken attack strategy. That seems to be what they were doing. Was they didn't know that the riders of Rohan were about to appear. They had no idea about Aragorn. They thought, we've just got this city that we need to take, and then we massively outnumber them. We'll just attack the city, just throw everybody at the city. There is a risk if one of the Nazgul went in on their own that perhaps they could be taken down. The fell beasts themselves they're not invulnerable by any stretch of the imagination, and whereas the Witch King himself seemed to know no real fear, the rest of them perhaps did. We don't really get into their minds much at all, but what they would have considered to be a zero risk strategy was, we'll go up to the gates, we'll blow them down, we've got a massive battering ram, we'll go there, and then everybody will just push forward as one. And having the Witch King spreading fear as the army approached was a really strong strategy that worked. So yeah, they could have done it. There's no reason why Gandalf didn't have. I mean, maybe he showed he could do clever things with light magic and something like as kind of a defensive shield or something like that. So it makes sense to them if they're wanting a lowest risk strategy, just to push forward. Let's go to Charis Ballerina, picking up a question for the nerd far away. What do you suppose was Thranduil's intention as he built his kingdom? A sanctuary, an escape? Neither, both. Thranduil's intention. Right. So, I mean, I've talked about this a couple of times. Thranduil, I find an endlessly complex character. I used to really not like Thranduil, I will be honest, because his plan was just to retreat and retreat and retreat into that far corner of Mirkwood and just feast and have fun. That seems to be what it was. It wasn't some kind of grand strategy. It was about managed retreat, a sanctuary and an escape, yes, but he didn't seem to have the drive, the interest, the intention to actually investigate or oppose this force in the south of his forest. So it was just backing up. I wish I could say it in a slightly nicer way, but that's not what it was. The layer of complication for him is that he has clearly, from how Tolkien describes it, some form of what today we'd call post-traumatic stress. He was in that battle we talked about almost at the beginning of the stream, when his father led the forces down in the last alliance of elves and men, and they got largely destroyed. He saw his father, he saw his friends, he saw his companions wiped out before him in horrific fashion. And we're told after this, he couldn't even face south anymore. He couldn't even look in the direction that those things happened in. So the idea that he just backed away from the growing threat from Sauron in the south of Mirkwood is actually a lot more understandable when you realize that he what Tolkien would have called shell shock. He just did not wish to face this anymore. And it makes a whole lot more sense of why when we meet them, the elves of northern Mirkwood, they're feasting. They're very suspicious of other people the dwarves coming through. They don't have much contact with the outside world except to import wine and butter and the nice things of this world. It's in denial. They're just in denial of what's going on. So it's not, his intention is not anything particularly positive. Rika Reese, yes, I did see your super chat, and I answered it a little while ago. Have I got another question in the chat? Oh, actually, is there another one? Actually, here, Reflective Ramblings picked up, saying, Rika DeVries saying, did the White Council meet and act in the time of the Lord of the Rings? Not per se, no. So they met during the time of The Hobbit, when they decided to meet to face Sauron in we've been talking about it in the south of Mirkwood, and push him out. So that bit in The Hobbit where, excuse me one moment, that bit in The Hobbit where Gandalf just abandons the dwarves, and as they're about to go into northern Mirkwood, and said, I'll hopefully see you later, and then he went off south. That was because he'd arranged to meet up with the rest of the White Council, which I'd have loved to have seen, but that was not the main quest we were reading the story about. So he then went and met up with them and then attacked Dol Guldur. But then after that, no, not during the time of the Lord of the Rings, because by then Saruman was really focused in on doing his thing. I think I've got another question here. Caius Ballerina, do elves not decompose? Why are they still visible in the dead marshes? Also, aren't the fell beasts based on the eagles, not dragons, or are both? Yeah, so, well, I'll answer the first bit. In terms of the dead marshes, and I can't remember who says it, it might have been Gandalf, but basically, why are all of those elves still there? This is Sauron, who's just creating extra defenses around Mordor. And it's like, what's a really good defense? Well, let's have some marshes with the bodies and faces of your dead enemies. It's disgusting. So this was Sauron, and this is another. We talked a little bit about Sauron, the necromancer. He does a lot of, whereas he might not do the classic, what we might think of today as the classic necromancer, let's build myself a zombie army kind of thing. He does a lot of defying death-ish bits of magic, and this is another one. These are the bodies of the elves who have basically been suspended there and made to be working for him, which is horrible. The Dead Marshes is supposed to be disconcerting and horrible, and it's one of the few times that Tolkien kind of admits that he doesn't like doing it, but this is his experience. He was in the Somme, one of the most horrific wars in the First World War, and he remembers seeing bodies face up in deep puddles looking up at him, and this is his war trauma. Which is playing out, and this is Sauron. This is dark. Tolkien obviously hated it, and so this is dark magic indeed to do that. The second bit, aren't the fell beasts based on the eagles, not dragons, or are both? Yeah, so we're not. And the short answer is we're not told. It's not this easier categorization. We're told definitely the orcs were created in mockery of the elves. I think it's not exactly in the same words, but the trolls and the ents thing is definitely there. When it comes to dragons and fell beasts, as a mockery of the eagles, I mean a bit of both. The difference is that Morgoth was the great, I would say creator, but he's not a creator. He's like the person who makes the mockery. He cannot create the original thing. He was the one. He created dragons, and that is the creation as a mockery of the eagles, as far as we can tell. And then the fell beasts, we're not really told much about them. They appear right towards the end of the Lord of the Rings. Are they like the eagles? Well, certainly they face up to the eagles in that last battle. The eagles come in for that final battle and do attack them. So yes, my take is probably these are some sort of descendants from dragons, and so yes, they're the same kind of thing, but we're not told exactly. Let's go to Martin S. I believe you are right about Thranduil's fears of the shadow, but couldn't he not have moved to Valinor if he felt that way? He wasn't an elf after all. Yeah, he could have done, but I think he was committed to ruling those elves. And those elves, let's not forget, again, we covered this a little bit earlier in the stream, but the elves of Mirkwood were the elves who deliberately didn't go to Valinor for one reason or another. Some of them, a good part of them, were ones who set off for Valinor, got to the Misty Mountains and thought this is all a bit hard work, and then stopped and found somewhere to stay. Plus a few who decided they weren't going to go there at all and were just wandering around and found a nice forest to stay in. Plus some who were left over after the end of the War of Wrath, which is at the end of the First Age, and basically the Valar said, okay, everyone, we can all now go back to Valinor, and these ones were the ones who said, yeah, no, I'm quite happy staying here in Middle-earth. So all of those elves there in Mirkwood, they were, for different times and different reasons, they were elves who said they did not want to go. Now, some of them, I'm sure, eventually did. Legolas is a prime example, but he was their ruler, and they were there because they liked living in a forest and they enjoyed being in Middle-earth, and fair play to them. So that's why they could have done, but they didn't want to. A reflective rambling, saying silly time, excellent. Bombadil, Tyrion, and Jaskier walk into a pub. What shape is it? Or town in the morning? What shape is it in the morning? Tom Bombadil, Tyrion, and Jaskier walk into a pub. Wow. I mean, I don't get... So, I'm going to take this far more seriously than you intended. Tom Bombadil's not the trashing the town kind of guy. If he walks into a pub, Tom Bombadil's going to be sitting there around the roaring fire, drinking a pint of something very nice, eating some gorgeous food, telling tales, and just enjoying life, singing songs with people. So actually, he's the ideal person to be in a pub. Jaskier in a pub, I think him and Tyrion could cause some problems, but I suspect that they will probably both end up in sort of trying to escape their way from some woman's boudoir while running away from a jealous husband or something like that. That certainly seems to be, and I'm glad, incidentally, season 3 of The Witcher had a scene like that with Vespula, with Jaskier, which was a good thing that they introduced that one. So what shape is it? I think the town will be good, but I think there'll be a lot of good times will be had by all. Let's go. So my last question from my patrons. So this is a good time to drop anything else into the chat. I'll try and pick up as much as that as I can. Samuel Sabo saying, "Hi Robert, if you have one, what is your favorite trope in fantasy? Wishing you a very nice evening." Well, thank you very much. My favorite trope. I was thinking about this, and I think the thing about tropes is that when they're done badly, then it's just very derivative. When they were, again, I'm taking this question far more seriously than you probably intended. When they work well, they provide a shortcut for the reader, for the audience, so that we don't have to have reams of explanation. We just go, I understand that. We can get on with the plot. So it's more science fantasy rather than pure fantasy. But I've always loved the hyperdrive, or warp speed, or whatever you call it. It's the same thing. You go to Star Wars, Star Trek, and the person says, right, engage hyperdrive, go to warp speed. And we know what that means. We know that means that we can get from this point to over here. We don't have to have all the travel stuff in the meantime. We're just traveling very fast, and probably in some kind of different dimension or something, which allows us to. The actual explanation doesn't matter, because simply saying engage hyperdrive, we have seen it so many times that we don't need it explained. We're going very fast now. We've got our normal trundling around kind of speed, and then we've got the zipping off to somewhere speed. So that, I think, works as a trope should work, which is it doesn't feel tired when we read it or we experience it. It just helps us not have pages and pages of exposition. Okay. Let's go have a quick flick through the chat. Matthias saying, favorite trope in D&D, a magic talking sword that is secretly evil and corrupting. That is, yes, absolutely. That's an Elric of Menibene kind of thing. Having a quick flick through. Reflective Rambling saying the poor loot. Yes, absolutely. Matthias saying Robert just went, one does not simply make silly jokes about Tom Bombadil. I think you can make silly jokes about Tom Bombadil, but maybe not now. Maybe I'm in a serious mood for this. Impending Inspiration saying, could or would all elves experience sea longing, or are there some that never could? I think all elves are capable of it. So the sea longing is basically this desire you have to, pulling in your soul, that you have to go west. It's interesting with Legolas, because Legolas had never had the sea longing. He loved Middle-earth. He enjoyed being in Middle-earth. And basically Galadriel says to him, when you hear the gull, that's when you'll get the sea longing. She says it in a lot more eloquent way than me, but that's what it is. And he obviously hears the gull when he gets closer to the coast. Now, if he'd never traveled to the coast, he would never have heard the gull. So presumably he never would have had the sea longing. So the idea was within him, always potentially there, but the reality, no. So I think you said, could or would all elves experience the sea longing? I think all elves could experience the sea longing, but not all elves would. I think that's a quick flick through. I think that's probably me largely caught up in the chat as well. Okay, with this, let me start to wrap this up and talk a little bit about what we shall do over the next few weeks. I'm keen to be getting on with our Targaryen Rulers series. We've been doing that for a few weeks, and we're starting to make our way towards the end. We've got, and I might even do it next week. Keep an eye out for what I schedule. I want to do the Bloodraven live stream. When we've been doing these streams, looking at the different Targaryen rulers. It's the Targaryen rulers and the people who either nearly were or could have been or were secretly behind the scenes ruling. So we did Maester Aemon because he was offered to be the ruler, the Targaryen king. He just turned it down. Bloodraven was never offered, but you could certainly argue for a few decades, 2 or 3 decades, he was the most powerful Targaryen out there. So we'll be looking at him. We've still got Jaehaerys II. We've still got the Mad King himself. And then we could look at Viserys, Daenerys, and Rhaegar. So I think perhaps what I'm going to do is I'm going to start bringing this around to then looking at Robert's Rebellion. At some point, I've done a massive series of videos about Robert's Rebellion. At some point, I'm going to redo all of them with a little bit more insight that I've got these days. I'm hoping maybe I will get to see, fingers crossed, the stage play at some point. We don't know when that's going to happen, but I have a feeling that will reveal a huge amount extra. But anyway, I digress. Next week, same time, we will be back talking about the Targaryens once more. I've got videos coming out between now and then. Do check out IDG Live. We're on IDG Live. Do check out my main channel in Deep Geek, but also the Well Told Tale. I've started trying to catch up with the stories on the Well Told Tale, trying to catch up to the podcast. So keep an eye out for that. Okay, I think that's it for now. If you're watching back a little bit later, appearing somewhere around here will be a link to other live streams that I have done. Appearing somewhere around here will be a link to my Patreon page, which is the best way to support this channel if you wish to do so. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, moderators. Excellent job, as always. Thank you, patrons. Take care, everyone, and I will see you again soon.